with understanding the many cultures that make each one of us who we are. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk at the Plato Academy. Thank you. I want to start by talking about how to thrive in a multicultural world. And I want to start with one fact about this. First of all, it's not easy. As the world grows flatter and smaller, we will collide with each other more and more, and we have to think about how we can avoid that if possible. And I want to offer a few suggestions today, but this is the problem of thriving in the multicultural world is a daunting, a very huge challenge. I think that thriving will begin with understanding the many cultures that make each one of us who we are. I think that's a first step. Now, as I start on explaining this today, I want to put up the caution sign. And as it says here, cultural comparisons and generalizations ahead. I have to say that I am a European American social and cultural psychologist, and I'm going to talk about differences between the East and the West. When I'm talking about the West, I will mean Americans in the United States. When I'm talking about the East, I'm going to talk about Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese, and refer to this group as East Asians. Now, as an American, I know that America is a very diverse place, that people who voted for Hillary Clinton are not the same as people who voted for Donald Trump. I know that. I also know that among East Asians, there's equal amount of diversity. I know that Koreans are not Japanese, are not Chinese, and so forth. I understand great variation. But in our studies in cultural psychology, we have found that there are some patterns of behavior when you compare East and West that can be identified that are a function of our different national cultures. And I want to talk about those today and see what they can explain. At Stanford, I am a university professor, and in that role, I have the opportunity to teach students from all over the world, many Korean undergraduate students and many Korean graduate students, and I've had the opportunity to learn from them about some of the clashes that they experience when they come from Korea to the United States. And let me start by telling you, first of all, a story of one student who has been particularly helpful to me in looking at East-West patterns. Her name was Hee-jung Kim. She came from Seoul to study in Stanford to work on her PhD. Now, like most American professors, in my seminars, I want the students to contribute. I want them to talk and express their ideas and opinions. That's what I expect. But with Hee-jung, there was nothing I could do that would get her to contribute to the class. I couldn't get her to raise her hand and talk. If I called on her, she would look at her hands, study the table, And she just wouldn't contribute. Even if I said, Hee-jung, next week I'm going to call on you, she still wouldn't say anything. So this was challenging to me. And one day I noticed on her email there was a proverb by this signature, and it said simply, "The empty carriage rattles the loudest." So it took me a while to understand that. I didn't get it at first. But then I realized this was Hee-jung's way of telling the American professor that she thought that very often the people that talk the most have the least to say. So this was fascinating to me. And as I got to know Hee-jung Kim better, I learned that she had grown up in schools that looked approximately like this. These are schools where students are encouraged to sit calmly with quiet minds, to listen to the teacher, trying to adjust their thinking to what the teacher is saying, trying to absorb as much information as possible. And she explained to me about the importance of hierarchy in Korean culture, the importance of knowing your place. She explained this is why it was that she had such difficulty, as did many other Asian students, of calling the professor, me, by my first name, Hazel. It took her a very long time to do that, and many students couldn't do that, and it was just impossible for them. And then she went on to explain that it is the same in the classroom. When you're low in the knowledge hierarchy, if you're a junior person, a student, why should you contribute to the class? Why should you just start talking? Unless you have a very well-formed thought, a very clear idea, then and only then, and you're sure that it's right, should you raise your hand. And if you're not sure that it's right, and if you're not sure you are the person that should be contributing, it's better to remain silent. So this was my first lesson. But I realized that Hee-jung had this experience, but many of the other students in my class, the students with European American students, they had grown up in classrooms that looked more like this. These are classrooms where students are encouraged to put up their hand and to tell their unique ideas, to compete with each other, to try to argue, even with the teacher, trying to influence the teacher, trying to debate, to stand out from the other students. Often in these classrooms, students put their hands up even before they know what they're going to say, just to put their hand up to reserve a place. And so I began to see that there were real differences that were underlying these patterns of behavior in my seminar. And as I studied more about it with my colleagues and with students, I saw that these differences in classroom behavior reflected some very deep cultural differences in what is the right way to think, to act, to feel as a person. I saw, for example, that in the West, we say, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. What does this mean? This means that the person who makes a lot of noise, the person who talks a lot, who draws attention to herself, is the person that will have power and influence. In the East, I think you might recognize some version of this, which is the duck who quacks the most gets shot. And this is a very different idea about standing out and drawing attention to yourself. It says that drawing attention to yourself, being different from others, might put you in quite a vulnerable position. And it suggests that maybe that's not always the best thing to do. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to show you some generalizations that come from a great deal of empirical work that we have done in cultural psychology, comparing East versus West. And I want to talk about where these differences come from, how culture shapes these differences in ways of being a person. And then I want to talk about how some of these differences relate to being happy and to having a good life. So let me summarize a lot of this work through a few quizzes. I'll start with this one. Okay, so this is a quiz for you, so you have to participate. It's a test. So suppose I offer you a handful of pens, 5 pens, and I say, please take one as a gift. And there are 4 of one color, say orange, and 1 of another color, say green. So let me see a show of hands. How many people would say they want the orange pen? The one that's in the majority. Let me see a show of hands here. Raise your hand high, so I can't see too well, but I want to get an estimate. Okay, quite a few people say orange. Okay, hands down. Now let me see a show of hands for how many people will say they want the green pen, the one that's unique and in the minority. Okay, there's a lot of people in here that like the unique pen, and I'd say about, I don't know, about half and half. Let me show you what the data show from this study has been done many times. What you see is that most of the time when this has been done in East Asia, that East Asians, this includes Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, many, many different samples, East Asians tend to say that they would prefer the pen that there is the most of, the pen that's in the majority. Americans tend to say, no, I don't want that pen, I want the one that's distinctive, that's the green pen, that's the pen that stands out. And so I think this looks to be quite a group that likes the distinctive pen as well in here tonight. Okay, so that's one quiz. Now we got another quiz. We'll see how you do on that. This is another one. Okay, your house is on fire. I'm sorry. Now, you come home and your house is on fire, and inside the house is your mother and your spouse, okay? And it's very serious fire. You can only have time to save one person. You can't save them both. You can't say you're going to save them both. So this is a hard question. It's been the subject of quite a few studies in psychology. Now let me see a show of hands for people who would save their mother. Hands up. I think I see a large majority. Okay, hands down. Let me see how many would save their spouse. There's some, but minority. Okay. What you see, and these data are from a large number of studies done in Taiwan, that the Taiwanese response is save the mother. And the Chinese respondents tell us it's obvious. Your mother gave you life. You must honor your mother, your parents. They are the beginning of everything. They are the start of the world. They mean everything. They say, you can always get another spouse. The Americans have quite a different answer to this. They say, spouse, of course, spouse. Spouse is my choice. Spouse is the reflection of my preference. Spouse is the person, my soulmate, the person that I want to make my life with. Of course, I would choose my spouse. So just a very sharp difference in behavior in this emergency situation. I do them to say that, how could we put them together, the responses that you gave and the responses that we see and the differences between East and West. Of course, when you're explaining behavior, there's many factors that explain behavior, anyone's behavior. But what we see is there's at least one factor that can explain some of these East-West differences that gives us a clue to cultural clashes. And this first factor I'm going to talk about has to do with how people answer that very important question of What does it mean to be a good and a right person? What should a good person who's doing the right thing, what should that person be doing in life? This is a big question that people have to answer, societies have to answer. And what we found in comparing East and West is that there are at least two big right answers to these questions. They're both right, they're both viable answers, they're both important ways to live, they're both important ways for societies to be organized, but in fact they are different. And they correspond to East and West. Let me start over here on the right, and let me start with independence. And this is a way of answering what is a person supposed to be doing that's very common in the West. And on the left is a way of answering this question that's much more common in the East, throughout East Asia. Now, both of these figures show a central circle which depicts the self surrounded by other circles, which are important others in one's life. People everywhere are always in interactions with others, but it's the nature of the interaction that varies. So with independence on the right, you see that there's a sharp boundary, a sharp line between the self and others. So others are close, but they are separate from the self. On the left, under interdependence, what you see is that the circle of the self is overlapping the circle of others. And what's marked here in red, what really matters with interdependence, is relations with others. So people are closer to each other, they're tighter with each other, and being a person involves connecting to others, adjusting to others, relating to others. Looking again on the right here with independence, what we see is that the right way, the culturally appropriate and normative answer for how to be a person in many places in the West, particularly in the United States, people should feel somewhat separate, somewhat different, somewhat unique from others. This is the preference for uniqueness that we see in much of the West. We also see that they should be, as part of being the right kind of person, they should be trying to influence others and influence the world. And the way to influence others is often through talking, through expressing your ideas, through your opinions, to communicating them to others. Next in the list, people should be free. Free means free from history, free from tradition, free from circumstance, free from place. They should not be too influenced by these things. They should be relatively free of those influences. And finally, instead of an emphasis on hierarchy and knowing your place in the hierarchy and fitting in, as is common in most of East Asia, in the West, particularly in the United States, there's a lot of talk about equality and people being equal and being worried about being equal. And people feel that they're equal, if not better, to others in many cases. On the left, with interdependence, you see that things are really quite a bit different. The focus is on maintaining relationships, keeping one's relationships in good shape, being aware of the ways in which you are connected to others and similar to others, adjusting, fitting in with the important others in one's life, meeting their expectations, meeting their obligations, following your various norms that are important in certain situations, being very aware that you are not free, but instead rooted in history, rooted in place, in circumstance, in tradition, that these matter to who you are. And finally, this awareness that we've talked about, awareness of hierarchy and where you stand in various hierarchies, is an important thing to being the right kind of person in the society. These are words from an American anthropologist that in words rather than a graph tries to summarize. This person says, Plath, the American cultural nightmare is that the individual throb of growth will be sucked dry in slavish social conformity. All lifelong, our central struggle is to defend the individual from the collective. Now, this is a little bit extreme, but it does give you a sense of an underlying American idea of a worry about too much influence from other people and trying to be somewhat free from them. This is a pervading sense that helps people understand about Americans. That's why the norm for Americans is not to follow the norm in many cases. They often are trying to be different or distinctive. This is a quote from a Japanese anthropologist, and once again, the Japanese are not the Koreans, but from my American perspective, I see some similarity. She writes, "The social self does not exist without the social other. The social self is always dialogically defined in terms of the social other in a given social context." And then she goes on to say, and what I think is a very good phrase, is that a lone individual who must pour his own sake is on the verge of becoming a non-self. So this is once again an extreme statement from an anthropologist, but it gives an idea of the importance of the other in producing the person. And it's really quite a different idea from the American idea. So universal, we need other people, but it's the nature of our relationships with the others that is subtle but can be powerfully different. So now I want to talk about, where do these different theories of the self come from? Where do we get these different ideas? I think most people recognize that how we dress and how we eat and how we celebrate and how we worship, most people understand that those are cultural. But what cultural psychologists are working to explain is that the way we think and feel and act is also very cultural, not separate from culture. So I want to talk then about a comparison between West and East. I want to continue with it, and I want to explain why we see these differences between the East and the West, and I want to go through the culture cycle and give you some examples here. Now, East Asian culture cycles then emphasize interdependence. European American culture cycles tend to emphasize independence. That's why we see these different theories about how to be a person. So let me start first with the ideas level. These are these big pervasive ideas that are everywhere in our world. If we start in the American experience, you'll see that American ideas of what it means to be a good person are very rooted in Western analytic philosophy. This is Descartes. His answer to how to be a person was, or what's the right way, he said, the person, I am my thoughts. I think therefore I am. He had a very direct answer to what it means to be a person. I am a thinking person. This was the first principle of his philosophy. Descartes claimed that no one could doubt it. It was your thoughts that defined who you are. If we look to some way equally foundational for East Asia, you would say Confucius. What did he say? He said, filial piety is the root of all virtue. That's a very different answer, a foundational idea to what matters most to defining a person. You can imagine that people who have this in their tradition of filial piety, honoring the parents, those who have come before them, those who have given them life, might say that they would rescue their mother if the house was on fire. You know, it's not surprising where these ideas come from. Moving next to the next level of the culture cycle, the institution level. At the institution, we see courts and press and military. We see churches. I thought that I would look at churches to look at differences, institutional differences between Korea and the US. Churches are very important, powerful institutions these days in both places. Christian churches are very important and growing in both the US and Korea. And from the outside, Christian churches look quite similar. In Texas, the Lakewood Church, it's one of these huge mega churches. You can look inside the church and you see that it's like a concert hall. It's very much like this, and it's filled this way. Every week, this church is growing. In the American church, you can see that people grow in any kind of dress. They go so they can be their own person. They can be comfortable. It's very, very relaxed, but very important. Here's a church here in Seoul. I don't know if some of you know this church. This is also a huge mega church. And when you look inside this church, you see something that looks quite similar. You can only see part of it. Looks to my eyes quite similar to the American megachurch. One important difference you can see is people are dressed a little more nicely here, but of course that's expected in this society, just as it's expected to dress any old way you want in the US. But still, it would seem to an observer like these churches are churches, big Christian churches, huge churches growing in both places. A recent study looked at the mission statements of these churches, tried to see what the churches were trying to do as they were promoting Christianity. And here you see some very big differences among something that seems similar. So in the United States, the churches are emphasizing bettering the self, a great focus on the self, on growing and maturing in your own thinking, your own spiritual life, and letting people know that they are loved and accepted by Christ. So you see this in their mission statements, and you see this in the programming. This is from people who analyze many, many products from the church. The South Korean churches are actually quite different in their emphasis, although from the outside they look similar. They say that most important is to growing and forming a loving fellowship among people, spending time in social activities with others, and praying together and celebrating as a community. There's very little of this kind of talk in the American church statements. So once you see that these two institutions are sending messages about the right way to be a person, different messages in both cases while they are pursuing Christianity. So now let me turn to the interactions level. Interactions are what make up our daily life. Interactions with others, interactions with our devices, interactions with our social media in every possible way. In much of the work in cultural psychology, we look at the cultural products, what it is that people are spending their time with, because these products convey ideas about the right way to be a person. They're very powerful in this. For example, we often look at advertisements. If you're a company and you want to advertise your product, you want to associate your product with ideas that people in the various cultural settings feel are the right ideas. Let me give you a few examples of things at the interaction level so you can see these differences east and west. Let me start with, this is a poster from a school on the Stanford campus. It says, what? Dare to be different. Being different is good. This is a Dalmatian who has different color spots. This is very common poster that you see in the elementary school. My students tell me that this is an unusual sort of idea, thinking that difference is good, and they explain to me that in the Korean language, the word for being wrong, tulida, is often used to mean different in the Korean language. So wrong and different go together. Good and different go together in the American context. Let me show you, I'll show you two Samsung ads. This is one, this is the Korean ad. And in this ad, the one woman on the right, she's hoping to go on a trip with her boyfriend, but the boyfriend calls and cancels at the last minute. So they decide it's much more fun to be together, to eat a meal together, than to go with the boyfriend anyway. So it's a lot of emphasis on the relationship among the two women, and it's more fun than anything else. So the woman is not disappointed. And let me show you just a little bit from the American phone ad. This is for the new Apple phone. So you can see the ad goes on, but it's all focused on her, and you see her the whole time, just her, close up, just the individual. The Korean ads almost always show people in relationship to other people. They show the whole group. This is once again an example of cultural products that are subtly sending messages about the right way to be. It's not that anyone's thinking, oh, this is a message about the right way to be, but they are shaping us in many ways. Let me show you a recent study from Professor Na, where he's in the audience someplace. I saw him over there. This is a great study looking at Facebook, who's one of the products that really shapes us. And what it shows is that the Asians compared to the Americans, and you can see that the Asians give more likes, which is commenting on other people's products, than they do status updates. Status updates is when you're talking about yourself. And you can see that for the Americans, they give a lot of likes, but they give just as many status updates. They're telling the world about themselves. So wherever you look in our world of cultural products, you can see these differences that promote different ideas about how to be a person. So what I want to say is all these layers, 4 layers of the culture together, are working to create the differences. Now, final level, the individual level. Let me show you some differences in individual thoughts, feelings, and actions. This was a study from Shiwei Han, who looked at people's brains when they were answering questions about their mother and when they were answering questions about themselves. And what you see from the top panel is that the same area of the brain lights up for Chinese when they're talking about their mother and when they're talking about themselves. For Americans, there are different patterns, different areas are active when they are thinking about themselves and thinking about the mother. It's a reflection in the brain that these are separate. So all of this data comes together to help us understand why these differences that we see in our behavior are here as well in our physiological functioning as well, as you would expect if we see the differences in behavior. Let me show you another individual pattern of response, not at the brain level, but when we ask people, what's most important to you? And you will see this is the American responses. The Americans say family. This is open-ended data. They say health, and they say their activities, whether it's swimming or golfing or going to the movies. Activities are most important to them. When you ask Koreans, they say different patterns of response. What's the number one? Child's achievement is the number one, what is important to you in your life. Then they say family, but they say family harmony, and then they say health, but family health. So a focus on the family. This study was first done nearly 20 years ago, been redoing the study, and it's almost the identical pattern of behavior with the Korean respondents telling us that it is child's achievement that's still important. So despite all of the changes that we see, you see some ongoing real continuities. So you see, it's quite a different idea of what it means to be happy. So now I want to turn in my last few minutes here. I want to talk a little bit more about health and happiness in the good life. So let me just show you some of these differences that we've looked at and our colleagues have looked at that show the difference between happiness, East and West. Now, these, once again, are looking at cultural products, and if you see these two different magazine covers, they're both models, both beautiful, but look at their smiles. And you can see that this is work from colleague Jeannie Tsai and her lab, and what you see is in the West, and their lab has measured the size of smiles in many different cultural products. You have a very big, wide smile in the West. Here in Korea, you also have a smile, but it's really a calm smile compared to the excited smile of the Americans. Here's another example of this calm smile, similarity, beautiful women, but look at how you differences in how you display a good feeling, a good way of being, some sense of being happy. So we have to ask ourselves, what's in a smile? And from lots of work, we can see that for East Asians, small, calm smiles seem to be the right way. Why? Because this seems to suggest stability. Calmness allows people to attend to others' feelings, which of course is the right thing that you should be doing if you have an interdependent self. If you have a big smile, that's good from an American perspective because a big smile seems to equal happiness. Happiness, if you show with a big smile, it suggests that you have positive feelings inside you. And you're showing them, you're expressing them through your smile. And if you're smiling, you're happy, it means you're doing the right thing from an American perspective in which you are living your life well. This big smile signals that you're a successful person. It conveys this to others. So from many perspectives in the world, it's like, why are Americans have that big sappy smile on their face all the time? What does that mean? This is what it means. This also means that because you should be so positive from an American perspective to convey to other people that you have good internal features and that you are a good person, you should at all costs try to avoid negativity. In East Asia, because of us understanding that the light and the dark are braided together, that the good and the bad are braided together, there's a much greater understanding that negative feelings are also part of life. They're not your fault. They come and go. After the good comes the bad. They're intertwined elements of a natural cycle. So it's very important that when negative feelings come, you bear them, you hold on to them, maybe you suppress them, but it's okay to have negative feelings. It's expected, it's natural. From the American view, you should try whatever you can to get rid of them. These are two really powerful differences in how we approach happiness. And here's an example, one student, American student, saying something that's very common. I try to feel happy every day. I hate being sad or frustrated. It's so much harder to get through the day with these negative feelings. Americans really try to get them away. This is a Chinese student says something that's more common in the East, which is it's impossible to be happy forever. I think life is sometimes up and down. I want to have both balanced situations and balanced sadness and happiness. This recognition that harmony between the two, you should expect to both is part of life. So to end now, I want to talk about the fact that these cultural clashes that we have, they can make a huge difference for our behavior in the world. They can make a difference for whether you make a friend. They can make a difference for whether you're treated poorly in school or at work, for how teachers evaluate students if they don't understand, as I started, the difference in Hee-Jung Kim's behavior and other students. They can make a difference for how the students experience. They make a difference in medicine for how doctors respond to patients. They make a difference for who gets hired in the world and who gets promoted, for whether business is done or not, and very importantly, for how our world leaders respond to each other. So in the East, For example, people in the East, in the West, and this is very much my experience in Silicon Valley, that people of Asian heritage, they dominate the highest paying, fastest growing industries in the US, particularly in technology. Many Asian people, many Asian people. Yet, what we find in the US is that East Asians crash into what we call the bamboo ceiling. And you ask, why is this? Why don't we see Asians at the top levels, at the level of the chairman or vice chairman or the high levels? And when you ask Americans in those levels, they say, they just don't know how to be leaders, Asian people. Or they say they don't have executive presence. What does that mean? They don't have executive presence? That means they don't have an independent self, because from American perspective, that's the right kind of self to have. So this clash comes about because Americans look at East Asians and they say, the Americans smile and talk a lot, and then they see Asians who seem quiet and what they think are unexpressive, and then they think if you're unexpressive, you probably don't have any ideas. You probably don't have not much going on inside. So I think once we see these kinds of differences, we can ask ourselves, how can we possibly bridge these differences that we say? And we can think about changing our culture cycles. We can talk, and this is advice that I give in the United States. The first thing we can do at an institutional level is promote Asians into leadership positions. You can recognize and represent the important contributions of Asians to American companies. You can provide employees with a range of ways of expressing their ideas. If talking in a meeting is not the way that's comfortable, you can provide other ways to do it. And finally, you can respect expressive and emotional diversity. I think that's one of the most powerful things that we can do from recognizing cultural differences, is respect that there are different ways of being and find ways in our settings to allow these to be expressed. And in conclusion, I want to just sum up what I have said here is that culture cycles of independence promote a focus on the individual and on the individual's preferences and choices and on being different and on positive feelings and excitement. Culture cycles of interdependence, more common in East Asia, promote a focus on relationships, on adjusting to situations, on balance of positive and negative, on being calm. Both are good answers to how to be a person. They both have their upsides and their downsides. My own answer for how to thrive in the multicultural world is to be aware of these two ways of being. As much as possible, try to figure out ways to be both of these ways, to be both independent and interdependent, depending on where you are in the situation. In case of a clash, which is going to be common, I suggest that we assume that the other person you're dealing with, or even with yourself, don't assume there's something a matter with the personality. Don't assume it's a personality conflict. Instead, consider differences in the culture cycle that might have shaped that person and lead with interdependence. This is where East Asians have the advantage, very practiced in interdependence. Interdependence means, what do? You pay attention and you listen first before you talk. I think that's a very good way to start to analyze or begin solving a conflict. How to be interdependent. This is for the Americans. Listen before speaking. Emphasize your similarities with others rather than how to be unique. Rather than throwing a lot of choices at people, try to anticipate and meet their needs. I've had a wonderful 3 days here. People are anticipating my every need. They're thinking what would be nice and giving it to me. It's very pleasant. Focus on building positive and supportive relationships. Put relationships first. These are all sort of characteristics of interdependence that I think people in East Asia have more familiarity with. People in the West can learn this as well. There are many situations where they need to be interdependent. Then, how to be independent. This is something that everyone in the modern world needs to know as well, I think, because we need both of these ways of being. Speak up, first role. Express your unique qualities and opinions as best as you can. Consider each of your actions a choice. This is a very independent American way. Everything you're doing is not an obligation, is not an expectation. Think about it as a choice. Assert yourself. Concentrate on your own goals. It doesn't mean that you're being a selfish, going your own way person. It can mean that, but it doesn't have to be that. And then finally, assume that you have as much authority as anyone else. So this is a different way, not a hierarchical way of thinking. It's a focus on equality. Some situations call for this, not all of them. So that I want to thank you for your patience and attention.
As you know for sure, there's a huge individual variation in self-view, right?
Right, huge.
Within even one culture,
Yes.
per se in Korea, in the cultural level, we are living in an interdependent society. But some people are so independent, while other people are interdependent, right? So I can see that we are changing as well. So more people getting to be independent
Yes.
these days. But the problem is that culture is not changing as much as we're expecting because culture is more powerful than individual. So we love to change, but culture doesn't change because institution idea is difficult to change. So my question is that do you have any specific recommendation and the tips we have to follow to have a cultural change in timely manner?
Well, that's a very challenging and good question, but I think in a hierarchical society, it's very important that change begin at the top. And I would say that for leaders who can see that it would be useful for change to occur, that they could serve as role models. I think in the United States, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates have served very powerful role models. They didn't finish college, but then they went on to change the world through their inventions. And so people follow them. Even many students don't want to go to college. They just want to start building a successful business. I think in Korea, if leaders would start to make some changes, and I think some changes might be to flatten the hierarchy. It's hard in a hierarchical society, but some flattening so that there's more chance for subordinates to make contributions, to express their voices, a little bit more openness. Those changes could occur. I see them occurring, and I also think that in families and in schools, parents can work to encourage some more expression of people's ideas and opinions. In American schools, children from preschool, they learn to give a presentation, to stand on the stage, and they bring their favorite toy and explain why it's important to the class. So I think it's possible for there to be change. I think in this society that it needs to begin with people in power, but also, like the candlelight protests, people can also make change themselves.
So you should start from the top and from the bottom as well.
That would be my suggestion, top and bottom meeting. Yes.
Operating each other, and we have a best product, hopefully.
I would hope,
Yeah.
yes.
조직을 그만두거나 근데 그만둘 상황이 못 돼서 굉장히 우울해하고 되게 비극적으로 조직 생활을 하시는 좀 나이가 어느 정도 있는 고직급에 계신 분들이 좀 많거든요. 그런 분들한테 조금 좀 조언 한마디를 좀 부탁드리고 싶습니다.
I would say that your experience is a common experience. I recognize it myself so I know the problem well, and I think the answer is to do what you have done, to go on your own, but to also find other people that can support you in a more independent way of being, a more independent. It's definitely not an easy thing to do, but just recognizing that this is another good way of being. It's not wrong, or it's not a problem with you. Is the first step. And then, of course, as we were saying before, to the extent that you are successful or produce something positive, people will notice that.